Coming to DARPA is like grabbing the nose cone of a rocket and holding on for dear life.
DARPA is a place where if you don't invent the internet, you only get a B.
A DARPA program manager quite literally invents tomorrow.
Coming to work every day and being humbled by that.
DARPA is not one person or one place. It's a collection of people that are excited about moving technology forward.
For more than 60 years, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has held to a singular and enduring mission to make pivotal investments in breakthrough technologies for national security. Working with innovators inside and outside of government, DARPA has repeatedly delivered on that mission, transforming revolutionary concepts and even seeming impossibilities into practical capabilities. Welcome to Voices from DARPA, a window onto DARPA's programs and partners. My name is Randy Atkins, and I'll be your DARPA host today. More than ever, the world is awash in information. Unfortunately, some of that is purposeful misinformation, disinformation, and out-of-context true information. In a swelling sea of social and traditional media, how can we quickly spot the incoming waves of geopolitical influence campaigns and help analysts make sense of it all?
Propaganda is not new, but the speed and scale of it is new. The information ecosystem is rapidly evolving. Our adversaries are getting better all the time.
Brian Kettler is a DARPA program manager leading its Influence Campaign Awareness and Sense-Making Program, or INCAS.
The goal of INCAS is really to detect adversary attempts to manipulate target populations around the world through information campaigns.
It might be obvious, but what was the inspiration for this?
We saw in 2016 election, we saw interference from foreign states, certainly the 2017 election in France, and most recently, of course, the Ukraine conflict, where this is playing out both on the battlefield in the physical environment, as well as simultaneously playing out in the information environment online and in broadcast media and so forth. So I think this has brought this stuff to sharp relief, and we really need to be doing something about it.
Tell me about that. What is the need? What's the problem that you're trying to address? What do we need to do about it?
So the problem is adversaries that are trying to manipulate foreign populations through narratives online. So, for example, in the Ukraine conflict, we've seen Russia try out these narratives about U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine. And this is not really new. They tried this narrative in the 1980s with AIDS, where AIDS was asserted to be a U.S. bioweapon. And it started and picked up in various journals in India, and that got progressively picked up by more and more mainstream newspapers. We're seeing the same narratives really play out 40 years later. We're just playing out at very fast times and scale across a broad information ecosystem. INCAS is really trying to ultimately get us out of this whack-a-mole mode that we're currently in. We're very reactive. We see messaging about a particular narrative, say the bioweapons narratives, that we try to counter that with the opposite, most cases, the true narrative. And that doesn't generally work. People sort of, once something has made an impression, that kind of sticks with people. It's very hard to refute these things through rational means. So we need to step back and say, okay, what is the broader landscape of narratives that are moving? Not just addressing this at a message level, but addressing this at a narrative level. So INCAS is all about starting with the messaging, finding that influence messaging, and then really moving up to understanding narratives and how those narratives are playing out in a particular target audience of interest.
There are a range of teams with various expertise working on different aspects of the INCAS project. Becky Owens is Vice President of Analytics at a company called Protagonist.
So we call ourselves the narrative analytics company. And by that, we mean we work to surface and understand the stories that express people's beliefs, shape their identity, and influence decisions and actions. We ingest media from over 195 countries and 109 languages. So we have a huge media repository at our disposal. And we then target that media repository with queries. Once we have that media data, we then apply a number of algorithms to isolate conversation that we call narrative rich, which essentially equates to content that is emotive, expressive of an opinion, contains syntactic characters. And then from there, our team of analysts go into that data to surface the core clusters of conversations, which we call narrative. Then we train machine learning classifiers on exemplar content from those narrative clusters. And from there, we can measure then the size of those narratives in the conversation, which is really powerful because then we can view those narratives over time. There's a number of things we can do analytically once we have this narrative diagnosed.
I know it uses machine learning. I know it uses language processing. Tell me how so.
Once we target the data that fits our query, then that runs through our narrative richness classifier, which is the machine learning algorithm that we've developed over the years, where we've actually trained it on content that we have identified is representative of narratives. So this algorithm has learned the features of what creates content that is expressive of the narrative. And so that's how we first isolate the conversation that matters. So it runs through that algorithm. And then from there, our team of analysts start to go in and dissect that conversation.
And you keep using the word narrative, which implies storytelling, which implies to me, in some sense, emotion, which implies some messages resonate better with others. Do you sort of gauge them on that scale?
So we have what we call an impact score. So once we've identified a narrative, we determine its impact on the audience. And the way we do that currently is through measuring its resonance, which is a factor of how often people engage with that material. So how often do they share it, comment on it, reply, etc. We have a metric to measure that, but it's primarily based off of the audience's responsiveness to the content.
You're collaborating with the Norman Lear Center, which studies entertainment media. Why is that?
We partnered on this effort because they are the research leader in studying the factors that make media narratives especially powerful. They've done extensive research into elements of entertainment that persuade, engage, and ultimately mobilize mass audiences to action. They do a lot of analysis of different entertainment shows, popular TV, and how that impacts audiences around the world. We hypothesize that when thinking about influence campaigns, that effective influence campaigns harness the mechanisms of entertainment, whether or not that's the intended goal of the author. So they might not be setting out to create an entertaining influence campaign, but if it's effective, it usually does contain some element of entertainment to keep the audience engaged in that content. And we also hypothesize that influence campaigns can function as a form of entertainment for audiences who become enthralled with them or engage with them in some way. When you think of some conspiracy type theory influence campaigns that have taken place recently, there's definitely an element of entertainment, of the suspense and keeping someone enthralled with your message.
And DARPA INCAS program manager Brian Kettler says it will be important to identify the intent behind an influence campaign's message.
There's influence messaging for advertising purposes. We want to distinguish that from geopolitical messaging. So we're looking for things like agenda, which are calls to action, calls for people to believe or do something. Can we see those in messaging? They may be implicit calls for action. So getting computers to understand and recognize calls for action in messaging is difficult. So we want to be able to find those kinds of messaging. And then also look at things like, is the article using very strong emotion? Is it trying to promote outrage, which often causes misinformation, disinformation to spread?
Can you distinguish between weaponizing misinformation and weaponizing true information? I mean, because I can imagine a lot of the information out there is true, but used in, ways that could still be manipulative.
Absolutely. And I think the most effective weaponization is of information that has maybe a grain of truth. I think that's almost more effective than misinformation in general, where it may just be based on something completely fanciful. In Ukraine, for example, we're seeing narratives about Nazis that's really inconsistent on the face with the fact that there's a Jewish president of Ukraine. So those may be much more difficult to believe than information that's has a basis in truth, but's been spun and weaponized and aimed at a particular population.
The next stage of your project is really interesting as well. So once you detect these, I think you're then also looking at how susceptible populations are to the messages, right? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Correct. We're trying to understand in a target foreign population who is buying into these narratives that we're identifying, who is resonating with them, who's not resonating with them.
Some of this work is being done by Tarek Abdel-Zahir, a professor in the computer science department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
We work with applications of computing where computers are used to interact with sort of physical systems. And so what we do is we model the physical system, we understand how it works, And then we develop the right interaction protocols with that physical system. And recently I've gotten interested in social systems because a lot of what applies to physical systems, I think can apply to social systems. They're just a little more complex because people are less predictable than physical things. In modern conflicts, the conflict is no longer just physical. It's not, metal against metal. It's also a conflict in the information space where narratives go against other narratives to win sort of the hearts and minds of people. Now, there's an important difference because in the physical space, we understand exactly what a particular weapon can do to a particular object, and we know exactly the science behind all that, and we know, how to defend the properties of materials that may make good shields and so on. But in the information space, we don't have a science like that. We fundamentally do not understand what a piece of information can do to a population if it spreads through it, and how to defend against it if it's malicious. But understanding what sort of motivates people, understanding what people pay attention to, can help guide us to the right solutions. And so I thought maybe some of the background in modeling that I have from the physical side can be applied to modeling social systems as well.
Interesting. So information is a weapon. Is that right?
Absolutely. Information has become weaponized, and we just don't understand that weapon very well and how to defend against it.
But in terms of weapons, what's different, what's unique about information as opposed to physical weapons is that it can affect different people differently, right?
You can almost think of it as a mass weapon. I wouldn't say mass destruction, but it's definitely massively disseminated because it's so easy in this day and age to disseminate information at scale. So its effect is a lot more global. And of course, different people also react differently. So it depends on your moral foundations, perhaps. It depends on your culture. It depends on your norms. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the project is sort of to understand how people indeed respond to different types of information, what type of information they resonate with, who resonates with what, and categorize that in order to be able to create appropriate models. And, one analogy that comes to mind is that in chemistry, I sort of remember from high school days, they used to tell us this thing called the periodic table of elements. And what that is that all the basic elements in chemistry, they organize them into this table. And if you know the position of the chemical element in that table, you'll learn a lot about the element right away. You'll learn a lot about its reactions, interactions with other elements, and so on. And so what we're trying to do in this project is, wouldn't it be nice if we could construct the periodic table of social systems, sort of where we can categorize different types of people so that if you know the position of sort of that maybe social group in the table, you know a lot about its reactions and interactions with information. If we can do that, then I think we've done progress towards perhaps defending ourselves in the information environment.
Let's keep going with that. Tell me a little bit about how segmenting a population can help.
There are two aspects of it. One is simply in defense. There is some kind of conflict and the population is under some kind of influence that maybe is malicious. And you want to understand how best to convince a person perhaps to not listen to that malicious influence. And the other, of course, is to convince them to do sort of the right thing that you kind of want them to do. So I'll give you one example. Let's say hypothetically that you're talking to citizens of Russia in today's Ukraine crisis and you're trying to persuade them to refrain from supporting the war. And it depends on the person. So for some people, you just maybe want to show them the pictures of what's really happening on the ground, and that will cause them to change their thinking. To others, you might want to play the argument a little bit differently and say, look, maybe the war is not even in Russia's best interests. And so it's just not patriotic to support it because it isolates the country, it creates economic difficulties and so on. So from a moral perspective, that first argument that I mentioned is kind of like a care versus harm argument. Let's not cause harm. The second argument was more of a loyalty argument. Let's say the person is loyal to their country and, out of loyalty, out of patriotism, they should refrain from engaging with the war. And the interesting thing is, and we have moral psychologists on the project, there are many moral foundations like fairness, like loyalty, like care as opposed to harm, like respect for authority. And these are reinforced differently in different societies. They're reinforced differently, even there's differences among people. And if we can understand the foundations that a particular person or group uphold most, we can communicate with them better, we can understand them better, and we can perhaps convince them better.
I asked DARPA Program Manager Dr. Kettler whether modern methods of communication make all of this particularly challenging now.
Sure, I think it's the speed and scale of social media online, and it continues to evolve. If you think about it, social media is relatively new. So in the 2000s, we saw Facebook and Twitter emerge. They weren't around before then. In the 2010s, we saw Instagram and TikTok, which really moved this to multimedia. So now, in addition to text media, we're having to look at multimedia analysis. And multimedia has the potential really to move people more because it can have a lot more emotional impact with videos and imagery, as we're seeing from the battlefield today. And then ultimately, I think, who knows how this is going to evolve in the future, but we have massively online multiplayer game platforms. We have commercial sites like Amazon.com that have been used to spread disinformation through product reviews about quack cures, say, for cancer. And then if Facebook realizes the metaverse, I think that'll be another vector for online influence. So it's really this very dynamic environment where the platforms are evolving, adversary tactics are evolving. We really need to evolve our capabilities as well at that speed.
Are we doing that in a manual way right now? And are you trying to somehow automate this? Is that part of the goal of the program?
Yeah, we're doing it in a manual way, very ad hoc today. It requires a lot of analyst effort. And we're really just looking at the trees instead of the forest. So we're looking at individual messaging, how that's trending, what users are engaging with that. We really need to look at that, but do that at speed and scale, and then step up and say, what are the broader narratives at play? How are those relating to one another? And then ultimately bring the analyst insight to say, how might these connect with the goals of known foreign adversaries? And really to put those pieces together for the campaign. So we're really looking at a mix of automated means to detect influence messaging at speed and scale to understand the population response, but then bringing the analyst in to filter through some of that to connect the dots. So I think it's a new mixed initiative approach, but really with increased automation at the lower levels of message understanding.
A third aspect of the INCAS program is called the influence campaign modeling. Can you explain that to me a little bit?
That's really where it all comes together. So how do we bring information that is machine surfaced, these narratives and the underlying messaging, population resonance with those narratives, who's resonating, which segments of the population are resonating, and put that in front of an analyst in a human-machine interface that the analyst can explore and understand and start to connect those dots together to build a model of a campaign that may be occurring. So it's really where the analyst insight comes into the picture. Another aspect of influence campaign modeling is we want to be able to surface our confidence in the machine-surfaced analytics. So part of this is because social media is very noisy, some of our analytics are imperfect, we want to be able to surface that information to an analyst. So as they put the pieces of the campaign together, they can also formulate a judgment about how much confidence to put in that particular campaign. So that's another major part of the influence campaign modeling effort. And finally, we want to build up libraries of campaigns over time. So another piece of this is to understand, okay, as we're seeing a campaign, what are similar campaigns historically that might be informative?
So taking the whole big picture together, what does success look like?
So success is, can we develop capabilities that really fill an operational need? Can we ultimately develop tools? We're not really trying to develop a monolithic system that can transition to operational users that have needs in this space. That's a goal of many DARPA programs. The secondary goal is to really prove out that technology and demonstrate that we can meet these metrics on accuracy of detection and so forth. And then a third major goal is really doing good science. So we need to be able to show that we're advancing the science. We are combining some innovative natural language processing techniques, for example. We've already generated some research publications on those. So I hope to continue to be pushing the science in interesting ways.
So when the project's over, what are the next steps? Where does this go from here? How does it transition?
So ideally, there are transition targets identified during the program. We have an operational stakeholders group that we're bringing in many organizations from the beginning. They can help influence what we're doing. They can help provide sanity checks on what we're developing. They can provide test scenarios, use cases. So we've got them involved from the beginning. So ideally that they're involved, they participate with us. They take some containerized tools that we're developing. They try them out on their data sets in their shops. And ultimately, we can put this program on a path to transition to those customers.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks also to Tom Shortridge for his partnership in producing this program. For more information on the INCAS program or other work at DARPA, please visit darpa.mil. There you will find a link to download this podcast.